opening this up and thank all of you for coming today to listen to me talk about 1031 exchanges. As Rick mentioned, my name is Joy Eifrid. I am a business development manager and an attorney for First American Exchange Company. We are a leading qualified intermediary that handle 1031 exchange transactions all over the country. So even if you have a client selling here and wants to buy in another state, that's something that we absolutely can handle. I'm today going to talk the ins and outs of 1031 exchanges, but realistically, it's not your job to be the 1031 exchange expert. That's why we're here to help. The most important thing to take from my presentation today is when to even recognize an opportunity for a potential 1031 exchange, and then also my contact information. So I offer free consulting services to all of my clients leading up to the opening of a 1031 exchange. I kind of vet the deal to make sure it fits underneath all of the rules, because there are a lot of them. And then from there, if it's a good 1031 exchange, we would open up the deal and move forward. So how many of you have been involved in a 1031 exchange? Good. And how many of you even know what a 1031 exchange is or have an idea? And how many of you have never even heard of 1031 exchange? Okay, that's fine. And most people haven't. So that's something that's interesting. So what is a 1031 exchange? It is a way for a real estate investor to defer paying the capital gains taxes on a sale of a piece of property that they own. So it's essentially a tax program. It comes from section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code. So in the code, it says no gain or loss shall be recognized on the exchange of real property held for productive use in a trade or business or for investment, if such property is exchanged solely for property of like kind, which is to be held either for productive use in a trade or business or for investment. So all of that is a fancy way of saying you sell one piece of real estate within a certain amount of time. If you buy another piece of investment real estate, you can defer paying the capital gains taxes. Deferral is the key word here. So you have to remember, this is a tax deferral strategy. Now, there are some ways that you may get have a client that has a situation where they can eventually not pay the capital gains taxes, but for the most part, this is just a deferral strategy. So when your client eventually sells for cash, your client would be taxed all the way back to the original basis from when they first started exchanging properties. Okay, so what is a 1031 exchange? It's a tax tool available to investors. So this isn't something that someone selling a personal use home would use. It is something for someone that's selling a single family rental or an industrial building or maybe an office space that they own and also work in. There's lots of different things, but it is purely for investment purposes, which means not personal use. They would need to sell property and buy similar property within a certain amount of time, and then they can delay paying taxes on the gains. Right now, these are super, super popular, probably because the prices of real estate are still pretty high. So you might have a client that bought just 2 years ago and now their property is worth $100,000 more. Well, the IRS is going to tax them on that, and substantially. So this is a great way for them to defer paying those taxes so they can put those funds into a new property. So where does this come from? It started all the way back in 1918 when federal taxes started, and Section 1031 began in 1921. So this has been around for over 100 years. Real estate investors have been taking advantage of this for a very, very long time. It's not a new program. It's very well established. It has evolved over the years through case law. So one example of how things have changed is back in the day, the investor actually could hold their own funds between the sale of their relinquished property and the purchase of their replacement property. Now that's not true. You actually have to have a third party hold the funds, and that's what we do at First American Exchange. So we act as the qualified intermediary, they call it, that holds the funds between the sale and the purchase. Also, there were no specific time periods for when they had to identify a new property and buy that new property. They just could do it whenever, and now that's not the case. There are very strict time periods that the investor has to follow to make sure they have a good exchange under the rules. It is a federal law, but the states do follow it. So even if there are Ohio capital gains taxes, those also are deferred. And I should have mentioned too, it's kind of a smaller group. So if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, even in the middle of my slides, I don't mind, or at the end, go ahead.
Are you gonna go over like what for like property,
Mhm.
are you gonna go over that a little more specifically?
Yes, yes. So far, this is super broad. I'm gonna go into everything in more detail. But any questions, just even generally about 1031s? Okay. So what are the basic requirements of doing a 1031 exchange? So after your client sells that piece of investment real estate, they need to acquire like kind real property to be held for investment or productive use in a trade or business. So not only does the sale of the property need to be an investment property or a non-personal use property, but also the replacement property that they purchase needs to be an investment property or a non-personal use property. I have a lot of clients that call me and they want to buy their primary residence with the funds or a new primary residence, and that you can't do that. There are ways in which you can get there, which I'll talk to about, but for the most part, they need to buy something that's a non-personal use property. You need to identify replacement property within 45 calendar days of closing the relinquished property. So you actually have to put on paper what you plan to purchase within 45 days, which is a fairly short time period. You need to reinvest all of the cash from that sale. So any net proceeds you get from the sale of that relinquished property need to go into the replacement property. And then you also have to acquire replacement property or properties of equal or greater in fair market value within 180 days. So you have about 6 months to buy the new property or properties. Fair market value is the key there. I have a lot of clients that call me and they want to just buy a property for their gain amount or just buy a property for their net proceeds amount. You do actually have to buy a property that is equal or greater in fair market value from the time you sold that property, which means sometimes replacing a mortgage or debt or something like that on the replacement property. The same taxpayer that sells the relinquished property must be the same taxpayer that acquires the replacement property. So this is a benefit to a particular taxpayer. So you cannot change the taxpayer from the sale to the purchase. If me, Joy Eifred, sells a piece of property in my individual name, I need to go ahead and buy a replacement property in my individual name. I can't add my husband to title. The IRS would consider that a gain. So it's very important to remember that the same taxpayer that sells remains the same taxpayer that buys.
Can it be an LLC?
That's my question.
It can be an LLC. So if you have an LLC in title, you just want to make sure that that LLC purchases. If the LLC is a partnership, that partnership would need to remain the same. If the LLC is a sole member LLC, that's a disregarded tax entity. So say me, Joy Eifred, I'm the sole member of Joy Eifred LLC. I can either buy the replacement property in Joy Eifred LLC, I could buy it in my name, Joy Eifred, or I could buy it in new LLC 123 that I'm the underlying taxpayer on. Because in that scenario, I'm still the underlying taxpayer in all of those. But if it's a partnership, it has its own EIN, it's a distinct taxpayer. So I couldn't create a partnership on the replacement property side. Go ahead, Vic.
So to bring some sense to that, are we safe if we say the taxpayer ID for the reinvestment property has to be the same taxpayer ID that sold it? And if we keep the
You got it.
taxpayer ID number or
Exactly.
social security number is the key.
Exactly. So sometimes I have a client that's selling in their individual name and then on the replacement property, they want to bring in a partner or create an LLC to acquire it. They can't do that. So you can't create a partnership LLC on the replacement property side. What they can do is they can buy a tenant in common interest in their individual name and then have their partner buy the other half of the property. So there's ways around it if you want to bring a partner, but you can't create a new tax entity. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You have to replace the investment property, you said like in 6 months.
Mhm.
So just say for instance, you don't find anything
Mhm.
within that time. What happens is you just have to pay the.
Yeah,
capital gains
that's a
tax
very
at
good
that
question.
point.
So there's two potential ways that you can end up in a situation where your 1031 exchange doesn't work. The first one is you've closed on the relinquished property, so you've closed on the sale property, and you've identified a replacement property with us within that 45 days, and now it's day 50, for example, and you're realizing that you actually can't close on anything that you've identified, or you can't purchase anything you've identified. So you call me and you say, hey, Joy, it's not gonna work, send me my money back. Unfortunately, we can't release those funds until day 180. So when you've identified replacement property within the 45 days, we're legally bound to hold the funds for the entirety of the exchange period. So you would end up paying our exchange fee, the funds would be tied up for 6 months, and then also you'd have to pay the taxes next year when you file your taxes. The better case scenario, and it's, I don't even wanna say best case scenario because it's never great when your exchange fails, but the better scenario is that you don't identify any replacement properties within the 45 days. In that scenario, we can release the funds on day 46, so at least you can take the funds and do something else with them. So all that being said, the lesson here is there's no reason to rush your identification. And we're gonna get into identification and all of that. But there's no tax benefit in identifying on day 3 versus day 43. It all is the same as long as you identify before that 45-day deadline, you've done what you needed to do. The only thing that will happen if you identify really early and don't take the time to vet the property is that your funds will be tied up for 6 months. So that's a very good question. It comes up all the time. And unfortunately, right now, we do have some exchanges that just don't work out because they can't find the property.
And that's what would be my concern in this market.
Sure,
So that's why
so
I
our
thought about
fees
that.
are pretty minimal. Our lowest fee and most common fee is $1,000 to do the whole exchange. So I have a lot of clients that call me and they're like, it's worth the risk of the $1,000 to give me the opportunity to even try to defer $50,000 in tax or whatever it might be. So if you kind of weigh, sometimes I have a client that's going to be taxed $2,000 and I'm like, why even do it? You know, because you're just risking that money. But if you have a pretty big tax liability, it usually is worth it to at least give yourself the opportunity to put yourself in a situation where you could try to defer the tax. Okay, so we talked about buying for fair market value. So what does that really mean? To have a fully tax deferred exchange, which means to not pay any capital gains taxes at all on the sale of that relinquished property, the client needs to buy a property that's equal or greater in fair market value. In doing so, you need to put all of the net proceeds in. So any of the net proceeds, sometimes I have clients that say, I want to pull 20 grand out because I have this other debt that I want to pay off. You can do it, but you'll be taxed on that. So anything that doesn't go in is automatically taxed. So you want to put all the net proceeds in, and then if you have a mortgage or some type of debt on the relinquished property, you actually have to replace that debt on the replacement property. So say you have a debt of $50,000 that gets paid off at closing on your relinquished property. When you go to buy your replacement property, you need to have a debt at least of $50,000 on that property, or you can bring cash to offset that debt. So if you want to bring cash, you don't want to get a new mortgage and you know, these interest rate, with these interest rates right now, then you can bring cash, but you do have to get up to that equal or greater fair market value to have it be fully tax deferred. Now you can have a partially tax deferred exchange, so it doesn't invalidate your exchange to not buy something for equal or greater value, but you're taxed on the difference. So say you sell a property for $500,000, you have $300,000 in equity, $200,000 in debt. Now you only want to buy a property for $450,000. Maybe you couldn't find something valued at $500,000. That's okay, but just know that you'll be taxed on $50,000 worth of gain. If your basis in that property is high, so say you're only going to be taxed on $50,000 of gain, whether you do the exchange or not, in that scenario, you'll just end up paying the same amount of tax, so it's not worth it to do an exchange. If this situation comes up and you have a client that wants to sell a property that's valued less, just call me first before we open up the exchange, because it might be a situation where they decide it's not for them. Really, they want you to buy something for equal or greater fair market value on the replacement property side. And I'm sure I'll have questions on this. Yes, go ahead.
I think I get the first two, equal or greater in value, oh, you've got it in there.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, if you give us some more detail here about the equal or greater in debt.
yeah,
That
yeah,
thing I don't get. It
Yeah.
might sound counterintuitive that
It
if you had a
is.
mortgage you paid off,
right,
fine, now you've got to get a mortgage, but you said something about bringing cash.
right.
Can't quite visualize the mechanics of what you were referring to
Yes.
there.
So this slide here is a good example of a fully tax deferred exchange. My next slide is going to talk about exactly that. So let's talk about a fully tax deferred exchange first. In this scenario, you have a relinquished property valued at $2 million and they buy a replacement property valued at $2.5 million. So that's greater in value. Perfect. You have a debt of $1 million on the relinquished property, new debt of $1.5 million on the replacement property. So that's greater in debt. Perfect. And then you have all that equity going into the replacement property. Because you're equal or greater in value and equity, there's no boot. Boot just means taxable gain. It's just some fancy term they came up with. It's not really fancy, but It's a funny word they came up with.
The least fancy word.
It is, yeah. It just means taxable gain. So there's no taxable gain in this scenario. You would be completely deferring all the tax. Now, this example talks about buying down in value and some debt relief. So you have a relinquished property valued at 2 million. Now you're not buying a replacement property valued at 2.5, you're buying a replacement property valued at 1.8. So you have a $200,000 difference there down. You have debt on the relinquished property of $1.4 million and debt on the replacement property of $1.2 million, and your equity, all your equity goes in. Because you have that $200,000 debt relief, that gives you $200,000 of boot, so you'll be taxed on $200,000 worth
And what
of
you
gain.
mean in debt relief there is that the amount of debt on the replacement property is $200,000 less than the amount of debt on the relinquished property.
Exactly. So what happens is, and this confuses people all the time, because if you look at this example, all of their equity is going into the replacement property, which means they're not seeing any money. They're not seeing any money in their bank account to pay the tax on $200,000 worth of gain. They have to find a way to pay that tax. They're not getting any net proceeds from the sale because they're all going in. So this is where it gets really confusing, because the bank is getting paid off and the client isn't seeing that money in their pocket, but the IRS will still tax you on it if you don't replace it. Go ahead.
All right, so I was gonna ask a quick question. So let's flip those two numbers and say, let's say that they only had 400 of equity instead of 600, and they use the rest for the debt to keep the debt equal. It would be the same situation because there'd still be 200.
Yeah, you're pulling 200 out. It's
And
the
if they
same
could do
exact
that, that'd probably be
situation.
the smarter way if they needed the money for the taxes.
Exactly. Now let's go back to the original slide. And I think this might answer your question a little better about the replacing the debt with the cash. So let's say here you have a relinquished property valued at 2 million and a replacement value of 2.5, and you don't want to have a new debt of $1.5 million because the interest rates are too high or whatever the reason being. Not many people would probably be in this situation, but some could. You can just bring your own cash. However you get to that 2.5, it doesn't have to be a new mortgage. It doesn't have to be a new debt, but you have to get to that 2 million, really. You have to get there somehow, whether it's with a mortgage or with cash. So the differentiation there is all of the equity has to be in the replacement. Remember, you can't replace equity with debt, but you can replace debt with cash.
When you say get to that number, this money goes into like a fund or, I mean, like.
So I mean, to buy a replacement property valued high
Oh.
enough to have a fully tax deferred exchange.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that help a little? Explain that? Go ahead.
I think what it is, this is easy to see. If we remember to read it as, column A, column B, column A, the relinquished property. The value was 200,000. That was your, let's call it the proceeds from sale. You had 1 million of debt to extinguish, and that left you with equity of 1 million. Then column B, the replacement property, you got one of greater value. And in this exercise, you're to get to the purchase price of 2.5 million.
Need a
Just
bigger
putting
mortgage.
all of the equity, all 1 million
Right.
into that, but we're taking out new debt at 1.5 million.
Exactly.
Or new cash.
Or cash.
Or it could be cash.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one thing real quick, I see
Yeah.
some of you taking pictures, take as many as you want, but we shared the slides. You're gonna have this whole slideshow and other flyers that are already sent to Carrie. So you don't feel like you have to, but you're more than welcome to take as many as you want.
You have another
Okay, but
question?
the other one with going and winding up with 200,000 liability, that's a little fuzzier. I see where all the equity goes over, but you're
So all the
saying-
equity goes over, but you have a debt
didn't take-
relief because you're not replacing the debt in the new
On your
property.
new property, because it's a lower purchase price than the proceeds from sale.
Exactly.
A $200,000 different, and when what you showed is they did it with debt, with mortgage, they just did it with lower debt. So the IRS is saying, because you reduced the amount of debt you're carrying by 200,000,
That's a gain.
that's a gain,
consider that a
and you're
gain.
going to have to pay tax.
Exactly. So the way I look at this, and I do not know if this is true. This is all I do all day, every day. So I think about this all the time because this is that's like my most common question about why do I have to buy for equal or greater fair market value, and why do I have to replace the debt? That's usually the question I get. The way I look at it is the IRS and the federal government, they typically don't reward you by letting you defer paying taxes, right? Usually they're trying to get you to pay more taxes. So they believe they're giving the taxpayer this benefit of allowing them to defer paying these taxes that would otherwise be due. What do they want in return? Well, of course they want something in return. They want you, the real estate investor, to buy a property that's at least worth equal or greater value, because at least you're stimulating the economy that way, and you're purchasing something at least to the same extent that you already were invested in the market. So that's kind of the way I look at it. So anytime you sell a big property for $2 million and you want to buy a property for 200,000, and this comes up all the time, people call me about that. First of all, it probably would not be worth it to do the exchange depending on the basis, but it wouldn't be worth it. And the reason being, that doesn't really help the economy, right? You're selling a piece of property that's valued at $2 million and now you want to buy a little property. That doesn't really help. They're giving you a benefit, so they want something in return. That's just the way I look at it. Like I said, I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of what I've come up with. Okay, so we'll talk about all of the various reasons to exchange. Of course, you want to do a 1031 exchange because you don't want to pay your tax, but there's lots of other reasons that could come up. Maybe they're maxed out on depreciation, so they want to buy a property to restore, replenish their deductions. There could be co-owner problems where you own a piece of real estate with a partner and you want to acquire separate property to move on. So I'm gonna dive in a little bit here. This kind of goes hand in hand with that same taxpayer role that we talked about, because a lot of times when you're a co-owner, you own that property in a partnership or in an LLC. Now, Rick and I own this property together. Rick wants to do a 1031 exchange. I want to cash out. What do? So what you do is called a drop and swap. What that means is we would drop down from that partnership level of ownership. This is all prior to sale of the relinquished property, down into an individual level of ownership as tenants in common. So now I, Joy Eifert, own 50% of this property as a tenant in common. So Rick, who owns 50% of the property, when we sell, we're selling in our individual names, which would be us, me, Joy, as a taxpayer, and Rick as a taxpayer. Now I can cash out and Rick can do a 1031 exchange and buy in his individual name. So there's ways to do this if we have a LLC or a partnership that holds title on the relinquished property. If you have partners that are arguing or they want to move on and do their separate thing, but it does take planning ahead of time. If you ever have a situation where this comes up, please call me as far in advance as you know, because the earlier you do it, the better.
So if they're splitting it half and half, does the one who wants to do the 1031 exchange have to buy a building of the same value that
Half.
they both had, only half the values?
Whatever
Okay.
whatever their percentage ownership is. I could own 25% of the property and Rick could own 75% of the property. So it just depends. And that's an example I gave. We each own 50%. So whatever the percentage is. So now we're selling a property worth $1 million. We each own half. So when Rick goes to buy, he only needs to buy a property worth 500,000.
Okay.
Okay, tired of the 4 T's. So this goes to what is like-kind property, which I think you were asking me at the beginning. So like-kind property is actually super broad. It doesn't mean if you sell a single family rental, you need to buy another single family rental. All real property that's used for investment is like-kind to all other real property that's used for investment. So you could sell a single family rental and go and buy a vacant lot. You could sell a hospital building and go and buy an apartment complex or a condo unit to a farm. There's all kinds of things you can do with 1031 exchanges. Like-kind property, that rule is basically the best rule in section 1031 because it is really broad and it can allow you to kind of change your portfolio, diversify your portfolio, or maybe get out of being a landlord and renting properties altogether, but still continue to invest in real estate just in a different capacity. Oh, this is a big one. Relocation to another geographic area. Sometimes I have a client that's calling me and they're selling a property here in Ohio and now they're moving down to Florida or something and they can't possibly take care of the property up here. They want to buy an investment property down in Florida. You can certainly do that as long as it's within the United States. So you can go from Ohio to Arizona or California to Montana or whatever you want to do. I have a lot of clients right now that are selling here in the Midwest and buying in Florida. This is important because, and I'm gonna take a deep dive in, so you can buy your replacement property and hold it as your replacement property as an investment property for 24 months and then convert that property to your primary residence after the 24 months. So right now, what I see is a client that calls me, they say, hey Joy, I'm 60, I'm getting ready to retire. I want to buy a big, beautiful beach house that I can live in and live happily ever after in my retirement. How do I do that? Well, buy the big, beautiful beach house as your replacement property, rent it for 24 months, and then convert it to your primary residence. Now, it's your primary residence. If you live in it for 2 out of the last 5 years, you can take the Section 121 exclusion on gain. So sometimes, depending on how big the gain amount is, you can completely get out of paying the tax in that scenario.
How long did you say to live in it?
You have to live in the property for 2 out of the last 5 years. So that would be like a 4-year commitment, right? Because you'd have to rent it for 2 years, live in it for 2 years before you sell it, and then you can do the Section 121 exclusion.
Okay.
Can you count house hacking?
I'm sorry, what?
Can you count house hacking? You know, if it's can you live in it and rent it at the same time?
No. So you want to be careful. You have to collect fair market value rents. Sometimes I have clients that want to buy it in their LLC and rent it to themselves. You can't do that. But what you can do is you can rent it to your kids. So you could rent it to your kids, know they're taking care of the property or hope that they're taking care of the property. And then that way, after 2 years, you can move it to your, move into it, make it your primary residence and claim it as your primary residence on your taxes, and you won't be, that won't invalidate the exchange.
What about an Airbnb that you
Yeah.
occasionally,
Yeah.
you know,
So
once a month you
vacation
take a weekend?
homes have a specific rule, so anytime you're using the property for personal use at all, you wanna be very careful. It's very, very limited personal use within that first 24 months that the IRS allows. The rule is in any 2 12-month periods, consecutive 12-month periods, so that 24-month period, if you rent the property for 14 days, you can use it for personal use for 14 days. That includes like family members using it, cousins, whoever. If you're not receiving rents for it, is considered personal use. Or you can use it for 10% of the amount of days rented. So if you rent it for 300 days, you can use it for 30 days. As you can see, it's still a really small amount of personal use, but you can absolutely buy a vacation home and use it 1 or 2 weeks a year and then rent it the rest of the time. And then after that 24-month period, you can make it your second home, you can make it your primary, you can do whatever you want. But for that first 24 months after you acquire the property, you want it to be held for investment.